My dearest, your distress pains me. Let me offer you comfort in this moment.
England, 1863, Victorian era. The grand staircase of Willow Manor curved upward like a swan's neck, its polished balustrade gleaming beneath the light of a dozen candles. But June Willow would not ascend those stairs tonight, not as a guest. She stood instead in the servants' corridor behind the ballroom, her hands raw and reddened from lye soap, holding a tray of crystal champagne flutes that weighed nothing compared to the humiliation pressing against her chest. "Careful with those, girl." Lady Beatrice's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "My daughter will be announced within the hour, and I will not have your clumsiness ruin this evening." June lowered her gaze, the practiced gesture of a servant, though the woman addressing her wore silks purchased with her father's money, stood in her father's house, and spoke as though the Willow name had always belonged to her. "Yes, my lady," June murmured. At 23, June Willow had learned to make herself small. The true heiress to Willow Manor, she had been relegated to the shadows of her own home for 7 years, ever since her father's death had left her at the mercy of his widow. The servants knew the truth, whispered it in the scullery when Lady Beatrice was out of earshot, but truth held no power against a stepmother's legal claim and a daughter's inheritance, stolen through manipulation and forged documents. "Have you seen the Duke of Greycourt?" Eliza's shrill voice carried from the dressing room adjacent to the corridor. "Mama says he's terrifyingly handsome but utterly unapproachable. No one has secured even a single dance with him in 3 seasons. Then you shall be the first, darling," Lady Beatrice purred. "With that gown and your charms, even a man of his infamous reserve cannot resist." June's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the silver tray. The gown they spoke of, emerald silk with Belgian lace, had been commissioned using funds from her father's estate. She had been forced to stitch the hem herself last night, her eyes burning from candlelight, while Eliza slept soundly in June's childhood bedroom. "June!" Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway, her expression sharp with irritation. "Why are you standing idle? The guests are arriving. Position yourself by the conservatory entrance and ensure the gentlemen's glasses remain full. And for heaven's sake, keep yourself concealed. I will not have you embarrassing this family with your presence." This family. The words stung less than they once had. June had long since stopped correcting the fundamental lie. "Yes, my lady." She slipped through the servants' passage into the conservatory, a glass-domed sanctuary her mother had designed, now filled with ferns and orchids June herself tended in the hours before dawn. From here, she could glimpse the ballroom through the partially opened French doors without being seen by the glittering assembly beyond. And what an assembly it was! The creme of London society had descended upon Willow Manor for Lady Beatrice's ball, drawn by whispers that the elusive Duke of Greycourt might actually attend. June watched as silk gowns swirled past in a kaleidoscope of colour, blush pink, ivory, lavender, each worn by young women whose futures stretched before them like open roads. Her own gown was homespun grey, 2 sizes too large, cinched with a fraying rope belt. "They say the Duke has rejected 47 proposals," a young woman's voice drifted through the doorway. "That he's so cold his own mother despairs of him ever marrying." "I heard he ruined Lord Pemberton with a single word to his solicitor," another replied. "Utterly ruthless." June refilled her tray from the service table, keeping her movements silent and efficient. She had perfected the art of invisibility. Then the ballroom fell silent. It was not a gradual hush, but an immediate, absolute cessation of sound, as though every conversation had been severed mid-syllable. June's hands stilled on the champagne bottle. Through the gap in the French doors, she glimpsed the cause. A man stood at the entrance to the ballroom, tall and imposing in immaculate black evening dress, his presence commanding the space as though the very air rearranged itself to accommodate him. His features were aristocratic and severe, a strong jaw, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes that seemed to assess and dismiss the entire assembly in a single, sweeping glance. Duke Cassian Thorne, Duke of Greycourt. Even from her hidden vantage point, June felt the force of his presence. This was a man accustomed to absolute authority, to whom deference was not requested but assumed. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. "Your Grace," Lord Peton's voice quavered with nervous delight. "What an honor!" The Duke inclined his head a fraction of an inch, the barest acknowledgement, and moved past his host without a word. June should have looked away, should have returned to her duties, to the safety of her invisibility. But something held her transfixed, perhaps the contrast between the Duke's severe isolation and the desperate gaiety surrounding him, perhaps the recognition of a fellow soul who stood apart from the glittering performance of society. For just a moment, his gaze swept past the French doors and stopped. Their eyes met across the distance, his dark and penetrating, hers wide with startled alarm, and June felt as though she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in 7 years. Then, Lady Beatrice's hand clamped around her arm like a vice. "What are you doing?" her stepmother hissed, dragging June backward into the conservatory. "I gave you explicit instructions to remain hidden. Do you seek to humiliate us before the Duke himself?" I was merely—" Silence. Lady Beatrice's face was mottled with rage. "You will return to the scullery immediately. I will not have you contaminating this evening with your presence." Before June could respond, before she could retreat to the safety of shadows, a voice cut through the conservatory air with the precision of a blade. "Unhand her." The champagne flutes clinked softly against one another as June maneuvered through the servants' passages that threaded behind Willow Manor's grandest rooms like veins beneath skin. Lady Beatrice had been explicit in her instructions. June was to remain perpetually in motion, yet perpetually invisible, a ghost tending to the material needs of the living. She emerged behind the velvet curtains that lined the ballroom's western wall, slipping into the narrow space between fabric and plaster, where footmen typically positioned themselves during grand events. From here, she could monitor the guests' glasses through discreet gaps in the drapery, appearing only when summoned or when a tray needed replenishing. The ballroom was a spectacle of calculated splendor. 3 crystal chandeliers, her mother's pride, imported from Vienna, cast fractured light across the polished parquet floor where couples whirled in precise formations. The musicians, positioned in the gallery above, filled the air with a waltz that seemed to physically lift the dancers, their movements as choreographed as their conversations. 47 proposals. A woman's voice drifted through the curtain gap near June's shoulder. "Can you imagine? Lady Thornbury told me her daughter practically prostrated herself before him last season, and he simply walked past as though she were a piece of furniture. My dear, Lord Pemberton made the mistake of questioning one of the Duke's business arrangements," another voice replied, hushed with delicious scandal. "Within a fortnight, Pemberton's entire estate was in receivership. They say the Duke didn't even raise his voice, simply dispatched his solicitor like an executioner." June carefully refilled her tray from the service table concealed behind the curtains, her movements practiced and silent. She had learned long ago that servants heard everything and were expected to remember nothing. "But surely he must marry eventually," the first woman persisted. "He's the last of the Thorn line. Without an heir, the Duke of Greycourt does not strike me as a man concerned with societal expectations," came the dry response. "Look at him now. He's been here nearly an hour and hasn't requested a single introduction." Unable to resist, June shifted slightly to peer through the gap in the velvet. He stood near the marble fireplace at the ballroom's far end, a study in aristocratic isolation. While the crowd swirled around him in a riot of color and movement, Duke Cassian Thorn remained absolutely still, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his dark evening clothes rendering him a stark silhouette against the firelight. His posture suggested a man performing an unpleasant duty, enduring rather than enjoying the spectacle before him. As June watched, a young woman in rose-colored silk approached him with the determined brightness of a debutante who had drawn the short straw among her friends. The Duke's expression didn't change as she executed what was likely a practiced curtsy and said something June couldn't hear over the music. His response was brief, a single sentence, and delivered without even the pretense of a smile. The young woman's face colored scarlet as she retreated, her mortification visible even from across the ballroom. "Ruthless," someone murmured nearby, the word carrying equal parts fear and fascination. June should have looked away, should have returned her attention to monitoring the guests' glasses, but something about the Duke's absolute isolation held her transfixed. Here was a man who stood in the center of society, yet remained utterly removed from it, who wielded power like a blade and seemed to take no pleasure in the wielding. She understood isolation. She understood the performance of presence while remaining fundamentally unseen. The fire behind him needed tending. She could see the flames beginning to subside, but approaching would require crossing a portion of visible floor. Lady Beatrice's instructions had been clear: remain hidden. Yet the fire was part of her assigned duties, and its neglect would be noticed. June drew a breath, balanced her tray, and slipped from behind the curtain. She moved along the ballroom's perimeter, where the crowd was thinnest, her grey homespun gown and lowered gaze rendering her nearly invisible among the footmen and other servants performing similar tasks. The fireplace seemed impossibly far away, each step a risk of being noticed, of drawing Lady Beatrice's wrath. She was 3 feet from her destination when the Duke turned. Later, June would wonder what instinct had caused him to move at that precise moment, whether he had sensed her approach or simply grown weary of his position by the fire. But in that instant, as she reached for the poker with one hand while balancing her tray with the other, Duke Cassian Thorne's gaze swept across the room and landed directly on her. The collision of their eyes was almost physical. His were dark, not merely brown but a shade that absorbed light, reflecting nothing back. In those eyes, June saw the rumors confirmed. This was a man who missed nothing, who assessed and catalogued every detail with the precision of a ledger keeper tallying accounts. She felt suddenly, terrifyingly seen, not as a servant, not as the invisible girl in homespun, but as something worthy of genuine scrutiny. The moment stretched, elastic and strange. Then recognition flickered across his features, not of her identity, but of the incongruity. His gaze traveled from her face to her rough gown, to the tray of crystal she carried, to the poker in her other hand. One dark eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch, a question forming in the set of his jaw. June's heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped her gaze, executed an awkward half-curtsy complicated by the tray, and turned to flee. "You there?" The Duke's voice was not loud, but it cut through the ballroom's noise like a knife through silk. Absolute, commanding. June froze. June had managed to escape the Duke's attention through sheer panic and the fortuitous arrival of Lord Peaton, who had intercepted his grace with an introduction to yet another hopeful young lady. She had fled to the conservatory, her refuge, pressing herself against the cool glass wall, while her heart gradually slowed to its normal rhythm. The conservatory was blessedly empty, the guests preferring the warmth and spectacle of the ballroom to the quiet darkness of her mother's botanical sanctuary. Through the glass dome above, stars pricked the November sky like scattered diamonds. June set down her tray on a wrought-iron table and allowed herself the luxury of 3 deep breaths. She should return to her duties, should slip back behind the velvet curtains and resume her invisible servitude. But her hands were shaking, and the memory of the Duke's penetrating gaze had left her oddly unmoored. "You there?" What had he intended to say? What had he seen in that brief moment of recognition that had caused his eyes to narrow, his attention to sharpen? "There you are, you wretched creature." June spun to find Lady Beatrice advancing through the conservatory entrance, her face contorted with rage beneath the elaborate coiffure that had required 3 hours and June's own aching fingers to arrange. I was merely making a spectacle of yourself in front of the Duke of Greycourt?" Lady Beatrice's voice rose to a hiss as she closed the distance between them. "I saw you, you foolish girl, parading yourself before him like some common trollop, using your father's ball to solicit attention from a man so far above your station he might as well be God himself." The injustice of the accusation burned in June's throat, but she had learned long ago that defending herself only stoked Lady Beatrice's fury. "I was tending the fire, as you instructed. Do not presume to correct me." Lady Beatrice's hand shot out, gripping June's upper arm with surprising strength. Her fingers dug into flesh hard enough to bruise. "You are here by my sufferance alone. A charity case, an obligation I have shouldered out of respect for your late father's memory, though God knows you've done nothing to earn such generosity." June bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. The pain helped her remain silent, helped her endure what must be endured. "Perhaps I have been too lenient with you," Lady Beatrice continued, dragging June toward the conservatory entrance, toward the ballroom beyond, where the music had paused between dances and voices, carried with crystalline clarity. "Perhaps you require a reminder of your true position in this household." They were steps from the ballroom now, still partially concealed by the archway but close enough that guests were beginning to notice the commotion. June saw heads turning, fans rising to conceal whispered speculation. "You are nothing," Lady Beatrice announced, her voice pitched to Carrie. "A burden, a nameless orphan my husband took pity upon, and I have allowed you to remain out of Christian charity. But if you cannot perform even the simplest duties without making a spectacle—" "Mama, please." Eliza appeared at the ballroom entrance, her face flushed with embarrassment. "People are staring." "Let them stare." Lady Beatrice's grip tightened painfully. "Let them see what happens when charity is met with ingratitude and presumption." June kept her gaze fixed on the floor, on her own worn boots beside Lady Beatrice's silk slippers. Humiliation washed over her in waves, each whisper from the gathering crowd another lash against her already raw dignity. This was the cost of being seen, of daring to exist in a space not designated for servants. "Perhaps the streets would teach you proper gratitude," Lady Beatrice said, each word enunciated with vicious precision. "Perhaps a night without shelter would remind you how fortunate you are to have a roof over your ungrateful head. That will be quite enough." The voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that silenced Lady Beatrice mid-sentence. The grip on June's arm loosened fractionally. June looked up to find Duke Cassian Thorne standing 3 paces away, his dark eyes fixed on Lady Beatrice with an expression that could have frozen flame. He must have been passing the conservatory entrance. June caught a glimpse of Eliza beyond him, her face stricken with mortification at whatever had transpired between them moments before. "Your Grace," Lady Beatrice's voice transformed instantly into honeyed deference, though she didn't release June's arm. "I do apologize for this unseemly display. A domestic matter, nothing that need concern." "You are causing a scene at your own ball," the Duke interrupted, his tone conveying absolute disinterest in her explanation. "The guests are uncomfortable." "Of course, Your Grace. I was merely disciplining." "Release her." The command was delivered without inflection, without raised voice, yet it resonated with such unquestionable authority that Lady Beatrice's fingers sprang open as though burned. June stumbled slightly, catching herself against the archway. The Duke's gaze shifted to her face, and June found herself once again subjected to that penetrating scrutiny. His eyes traced her features, the high cheekbones inherited from her mother, the unusual violet blue of her eyes, now bright with unshed tears, the dark hair escaping from beneath her simple cap. She watched something flicker across his expression, too quick to interpret. "You," he said quietly. "What is your name?" June's throat had closed. She was aware of Lady Beatrice's fury radiating beside her, of Eliza's desperate humiliation, of the crowd gathering to witness this unprecedented interaction between the infamous Duke and a servant girl. "Answer His Grace," Lady Beatrice snapped, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "June," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "June Willow, Your Grace." Something in the Duke's expression shifted, a subtle rearrangement of features that suggested recognition, or perhaps calculation. His gaze moved to Lady Beatrice, then back to June, and she watched as he performed some internal assessment that took perhaps 3 seconds but felt eternal. "Miss Willow," he said, the correction deliberate and pointed, "will accompany me." The conservatory fell absolutely silent. "Your Grace, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Lady Beatrice began, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "This girl is merely—" the Duke interrupted, extending his hand toward June, with the same formal precision he might offer a duchess, is claimed. The journey to Greycourt passed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves against cobblestone. June pressed herself into the corner of the carriage, acutely aware of the Duke's presence across from her, a dark silhouette against the passing street lamps, his face unreadable in shadow. She should say something, thank him, perhaps, or ask the 1,000 questions crowding her throat, but the enormity of what had just occurred had rendered her mute. She had left Willow Manor. After 7 years of imprisonment, she had simply walked out the front door on the arm of England's most notorious Duke. The unreality of it threatened to shatter her entirely. "We will arrive within the quarter hour," the Duke said, his voice startling in the darkness. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, will see to your immediate needs. Tomorrow, we will discuss arrangements." "Arrangements," June repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. For the marriage, he said it as though discussing a business transaction, which June supposed it was. I will obtain a special license. The ceremony will be private, conducted within the week. June's hands twisted in the coarse fabric of her servant's gown. Your Grace, I don't understand why. You require protection. I require a wife. The solution is elegantly simple. But you don't know me, June said, echoing her earlier protest. I could be. I might be exactly what Lady Beatrice claimed. A charity case with no breeding, no education, no... You are the daughter of Jonathan Willow and Celeste Beaumont, the Duke interrupted. Your mother was a French émigré from a respected Parisian family. Your father was a gentleman of means and excellent reputation. You were raised in comfort until his death 7 years ago, after which his widow systematically stripped you of your inheritance through fraud and coercion. He paused, and she heard rather than saw the slight shift in his posture. Have I omitted anything material? June stared at the shadow that was his face. How could you possibly know all of this? I make it my business to know things. There was no boast in his tone, merely statement of fact. When I recognized the Willow name, I recalled certain inconsistencies in the transfer of the estate. Your stepmother's claim was always suspect, but without a plaintiff to challenge it, the matter remained closed. You investigated my family based on a name? I investigate everyone. The carriage turned, and a shaft of lamplight briefly illuminated his face, sharp cheekbones, that unforgiving jaw, eyes that held no warmth but something harder and more valuable. Certainty. It is how one survives in society, Miss Willow. Information is currency, and I am exceedingly wealthy. The carriage slowed, then stopped. Through the window, June glimpsed iron gates opening onto a long drive lined with barren trees. In the distance, a massive stone structure rose against the night sky, all sharp angles and imposing towers, more fortress than home. Greycourt. Terror seized June's chest. She had escaped one prison, only to enter another, and this one belonged to a man whose power made Lady Beatrice's cruelty seem almost quaint by comparison. I won't be your mistress, she said suddenly, desperately. If that's what you expect, if this is some elaborate, you will be my duchess. The Duke's voice cut through her rising panic with surgical precision. You will have your own apartments, your own staff, your own funds. You will be treated with the respect due to your position. What I will not tolerate is interference in my affairs or emotional expectations I cannot fulfill. The carriage stopped before Greycourt's entrance, where light spilled from tall windows onto manicured grounds. A footman appeared to open the door, but the Duke raised a hand, staying him. I am offering you a transaction, Miss Willow. Safety and status in exchange for your name and presence at necessary social functions. I do not offer affection. I do not offer love. I offer protection, which you desperately need, and respectability, which I require. His gaze held hers in the darkness. If those terms are unacceptable, I will provide you with funds and a letter of reference, and you may make your own way. But you will not return to Willow Manor. June's breath came shallow and quick. The choice he offered was no choice at all, not really. Where would she go with no family, no connections, no skills beyond tending fires and scrubbing floors? And yet, the honesty of his proposal held a strange dignity. He was not pretending affection he didn't feel. He was not claiming altruism while expecting degradation. He was offering a bargain, stark and clear. I accept your terms, June whispered. The Duke nodded once, a gesture of finality, and opened the carriage door himself. Greycourt's interior was as imposing as its exterior. All dark wood paneling and ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow June's progress across marble floors that echoed with each step. A woman in severe black appeared as though summoned by thought alone, her silver hair pulled back in a tight knot, her expression professionally neutral. Mrs. Davison, this is Miss June Willow, my betrothed, the Duke said without preamble. She will occupy the Duchess's apartments. See that she has everything she requires. If the housekeeper was shocked by this announcement, she gave no indication. Of course, Your Grace. Miss Willow, if you'll follow me. June glanced back at the Duke, who had already turned toward what appeared to be his study, his attention already moving to whatever business occupied a man of his position at this late hour. Your Grace, she called, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. He paused, half-turned. "Thank you." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or discomfort with gratitude. "Save your thanks until you've survived a week as the Duchess of Greycourt, Miss Willow. You may find my protection comes at a higher cost than you anticipated." He disappeared into the study, the door closing with quiet finality. Mrs. Davison led June up a sweeping staircase to a suite of rooms that would have contained Willow Manor's entire servants' quarters. The bedroom alone was larger than any space June had occupied in 7 years, dominated by a canopied bed draped in deep blue silk. "I've taken the liberty of having a bath drawn, Mrs. Davison said, her tone softening fractionally. "There are nightclothes in the dressing room. In the morning, we'll arrange for a proper wardrobe." June stood in the center of the room, still wearing her rough servant's gown, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Mrs. Davison, I don't understand any of this." The housekeeper's expression gentled. "His Grace is a complicated man, miss, but he is not cruel. Whatever his reasons, you're safe here. If you're gripped by this story so far, don't let the adventure end. Hit the like button now, subscribe, share this story, and let's get this to 1 million views together." After Mrs. Davison departed, June found a letter on the writing desk, delivered with impossible speed. The handwriting was Lady Beatrice's, the words venomous. "You may have seduced the Duke with whatever vulgar arts you possess, but this will not stand. I will expose you for the grasping, conniving creature you are. You will be ruined, and the Duke will cast you aside like the refuse you are." June's hands shook as she read the threats, each line designed to resurrect the fear and worthlessness Lady Beatrice had cultivated so carefully. But standing in the Duchess's apartments, wearing a servant's gown in a room meant for royalty, June felt something unexpected kindle in her chest. Defiance. June woke to sunlight streaming through windows she had forgotten to curtain, disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her and the absence of Lady Beatrice's shrill summons. For a moment of pure panic, she thought she had overslept her duties. Then memory returned in a rush that left her breathless. Greycourt, the Duke, freedom. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of a young woman carrying a silver tray. "Good morning, Miss Willow. I'm Annie, your lady's maid. Mrs. Davison thought you might prefer breakfast in your room this morning." June sat up slowly, pulling the silk coverlet, silk, not the rough wool she'd known for 7 years, closer around her shoulders. "I have a lady's maid?" Annie's smile was warm and uncomplicated. "Of course, miss. His Grace was quite specific in his instructions. Now, I've prepared a bath, and the modiste will arrive at 10 o'clock with your new wardrobe." The bath was an ordeal of unfamiliar luxury. Annie had to coax June into allowing assistance, her hands gentle as she worked rose-scented soap through June's dark hair. June had bathed in cold water in the scullery for so long that the heated copper tub felt almost decadent, and the shame of being served, of being the one attended rather than attending, burned hotter than the water. "You've lovely hair, miss," Annie said, working through a tangle. "Like silk when it's properly cared for." June closed her eyes against unexpected tears. Her mother used to brush her hair before bed, counting the strokes in French. Une, deux, trois. When had she last remembered her mother's voice without the accompanying weight of grief? The modiste arrived precisely at 10, with 3 assistants and enough fabric to clothe a small army. Madame Rousseau was a sharp-eyed Frenchwoman who assessed June with the clinical precision of a general surveying a battlefield. "The coloring is exceptional," she murmured, holding swatches of fabric against June's face. "Not the insipid pastels they force on the young girls. Rich colors, emerald, sapphire, deep crimson. And the figure," she made a gesture of approval. "We have much to work with." June stood on the fitting platform, arms outstretched, while Madame Rousseau's assistants measured and pinned. The woman's hands were quick and impersonal, but each touch made June flinch. The legacy of Lady Beatrice's casual violence, the expectation that touch meant pain. "His Grace has requested day dresses, evening gowns, walking costumes, and riding habits," Madame Rousseau said, making notes in a small leather book. "He was most specific that everything should befit a duchess. Money," he made clear, "is no object. A duchess." June caught her reflection in the standing mirror, a thin young woman in a borrowed dressing gown, her violet eyes too large in a pale face, looking utterly lost among the sumptuous fabrics surrounding her. She looked like an imposter. She felt like one. By afternoon, her apartments had been transformed. Gowns hung in the dressing room in a rainbow of jewel tones. Slippers and boots lined shelves. Drawers held chemises and petticoats of such fine linen they seemed to float. June touched each item tentatively, waiting for someone to snatch them away, to tell her this was a mistake, that girls like her didn't deserve silk and cashmere. She was standing before the mirror in a day dress of deep emerald, the first fine gown she'd worn since her father's death, when the Duke requested her presence in his study. June descended the stairs with careful precision, hyper-aware of the gown's weight, the way the fabric moved around her legs. The footman who opened the study door betrayed no reaction to her transformation, but June felt stripped bare nonetheless. The Duke stood before a massive desk covered in documents, his attention fixed on a paper in his hand. He didn't look up immediately, and June had a moment to observe him in daylight, the sharp intelligence in those dark eyes, the controlled power in his posture, the absolute certainty that radiated from him like heat from a flame. "Miss Willow," he glanced up, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or approval, before his expression returned to its customary reserve. "Please, sit." June perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands folded in her lap to stop their trembling. "I have spent the morning with my solicitors," the Duke said without preamble. "Your situation is, as I suspected. Your stepmother's claim to Willow Manor rests on a will that appears to have been altered after your father's death. The original, which I have located, names you as sole inheritor." June's breath caught. "How did you—" "Your father's solicitor kept copies, as is standard practice. He was reluctant to challenge Lady Beatrice without a plaintiff, but he retained the documents." The Duke set down the paper and fixed her with that penetrating gaze. "I also have testimony from 3 former servants who witnessed Lady Beatrice's treatment of you. Testimony that, if presented publicly, would destroy her reputation and potentially result in criminal charges." "Criminal charges?" June whispered. "Fraud, theft, unlawful imprisonment." The Duke enumerated each charge with clinical precision. "Your stepmother has committed multiple felonies. The question is what you wish to do with this information." June stared at him, her mind reeling. 7 years of servitude, of degradation, of silent suffering, and he had unraveled it in less than 24 hours. "Why?" The question emerged as barely more than a breath. "Why would you do this for me?" The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I told you I require a wife. I will not have my Duchess's legitimacy questioned. Your stepmother's slander must be addressed definitively." It was a practical answer, a reasonable answer. But June saw something in his eyes that suggested the truth was more complicated than mere pragmatism. "This morning, another letter arrived from Lady Beatrice," he continued, producing a sheet of paper from his desk. "She threatens to expose you as an opportunist who seduced me for my title and fortune. She claims you have no moral character, no breeding, and no right to move in society." The words landed like blows, even second-hand. June felt the familiar shame rising, the voice that whispered Lady Beatrice might be right, that June was nothing, no one, unworthy of. "She is, of course, a liar and a criminal," the Duke said flatly, "and I will not tolerate her threats against my betrothed." The certainty in his voice cut through June's spiraling thoughts. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "You believe me?" she asked. "You believe I'm not, that I didn't?" "I believe evidence, Miss Willow, and the evidence is unambiguous." He moved around the desk with predatory grace, stopping directly before her chair. "You are Jonathan Willow's legitimate daughter and the rightful heiress to a considerable fortune. You have been grievously wronged, and you are, as of this moment, under my protection." June rose on unsteady legs, the emerald gown swirling around her. In the fine dress, with her hair properly arranged, she almost looked like she belonged in this study, in this life. Almost. "I don't know how to be a duchess," she confessed. "Then I will teach you." The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You survived 7 years of Lady Beatrice's cruelty without breaking. Navigating society will be considerably easier by comparison." The dinner invitation arrived 3 days later, delivered on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the crest of Viscount Hartley. June held it between trembling fingers, while the Duke watched from across the breakfast table with his customary inscrutability. "Lord Hartley is one of the few men in London whose intelligence I respect," the Duke said, setting down his coffee with precise care. "His gatherings are small, select, and focused on conversation rather than spectacle. You will find the company more tolerable than the average society function." June studied the invitation as though it might contain hidden warnings. "And if they've heard the rumors? If Lady Beatrice has already?" "They have heard the rumors." The Duke's tone suggested this was a fact of no particular consequence, which is precisely why we are attending. "Society operates on perception, Miss Willow. By appearing together, by demonstrating that I am utterly unconcerned with your stepmother's slander, we render her powerless. You make it sound like a military campaign. All social interaction is warfare by other means." A ghost of something that might have been humor touched his mouth. "The sooner you understand that, the better armed you will be." The gown Madame Rousseau had prepared for the evening was a masterpiece of deep sapphire silk that brought out the unusual violet cast of June's eyes. Annie had arranged her hair in an elegant chignon, leaving a few dark tendrils to frame her face. When June descended the stairs to find the Duke waiting in the entrance hall, she caught a flicker of something unguarded in his expression before his customary reserve reasserted itself. "You look every inch a duchess," he said quietly, offering his arm. The carriage ride to Hartley House was brief but felt interminable. June's hands twisted in her lap until the Duke's voice cut through her spiraling anxiety. "What concerns you most? The gossip, the scrutiny, or the conversation?" June blinked at the directness of the question. "I haven't attended a proper dinner in 7 years. I don't know the current events, the political debates, the books everyone is discussing. They'll know immediately that I'm educated by your French mother in literature, philosophy, and 3 languages." The Duke raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I'm certain they'll be horrified by your erudition. How did you know about my education?" "The same way I know everything else." His expression softened fractionally. "Your mother kept correspondence. The letters reveal a woman of considerable intellect who prioritized her daughter's education above social accomplishments. You read Voltaire at 12 and could debate Rousseau's social contract theory at 14. Unless Lady Beatrice managed to beat the knowledge from your head, I suspect you are better educated than half the men we'll encounter tonight." June stared at him, something warm and unexpected unfurling in her chest. He had read her mother's letters. He had taken the time to understand not just her legal claim, but who she actually was. Hartley House blazed with light, but the gathering inside was intimate. Perhaps 20 guests arranged in a drawing room designed for conversation rather than display. Lord Hartley greeted them at the door, his intelligent eyes assessing June with frank curiosity. "Greycourt, a pleasure as always, and this must be the famous Miss Willow." He bowed over her hand with genuine courtesy. "I understand felicitations are in order on your betrothal." "Thank you, my lord." June's voice emerged steadier than she'd expected. "I've seated you between Greycourt and Professor Whitmore from Oxford," Hartley continued. "I hope you don't mind academic conversation. Whitmore has recently published a rather controversial paper on educational reform that has everyone arguing." The dinner proved unlike anything June had experienced. The conversation flowed from politics to philosophy to literature with a vigor that reminded her painfully of her father's table before his death. Professor Whitmore, a gentleman in his 60s with kind eyes and wild grey hair, engaged her immediately. "Miss Willow, Hartley tells me you were educated primarily by your mother. What is your opinion on the current debate regarding women's access to university education?" June glanced at the Duke, who was watching her with an expression of careful neutrality that somehow conveyed encouragement. "I believe the debate itself is absurd," she said, and felt every eye at the table turned toward her. "The question presupposes that women's intellectual capacity is uncertain, when in fact, the only uncertainty is whether men are secure enough to acknowledge it." A brief silence fell, then Lord Hartley laughed with genuine delight. "Greycourt, wherever did you find her? She's magnificent." The Duke's lips curved in what might have been the first real smile June had seen cross his face. "Miss Willow is full of surprises." The conversation expanded from there, and June found herself debating education reform with Professor Whitmore, discussing the latest translations of Greek philosophy with Lady Hartley, and surprising herself with how naturally the intellectual discourse flowed. She had forgotten this part of herself, the girl who had loved ideas and argument, who had sat at her father's knee and listened to his debates with visiting scholars. "You've read Mill's new essay?" the Duke asked during a lull in conversation, and June noticed his attention had barely left her all evening. "On liberty? Only the excerpts published in the review." June met his gaze, though I found his conception of individual freedom somewhat idealistic, given the structural constraints that govern most people's lives. "You disagree with Mill's premise?" "I think he underestimates the degree to which liberty is conditioned by power." June's voice grew more confident. "A pauper and a prince may both be free in the abstract, but their practical liberties are vastly different. True freedom requires not just the absence of constraint, but the presence of genuine choice." The Duke leaned back in his chair, something like fascination in his dark eyes. "And how would you create conditions for genuine choice? Redistribution of resources, education as a universal right, legal protections for the vulnerable." June warmed to her subject. "Mill speaks of liberty as though it exists in a vacuum, but liberty without material security is merely theory." "You're describing something close to revolution," Professor Whitmore observed with evident approval. "I'm describing basic human dignity," June countered. When they returned to the carriage hours later, June's mind still buzzed with the evening's conversations. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something beyond a servant or a charity case, to be regarded as a person with thoughts worth hearing. "You surprised them," the Duke said into the darkness of the carriage. "I surprised myself," June admitted. "I didn't know if I still remembered how to think, how to argue. 7 years of silence has not dimmed your intellect in the slightest." There was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. "You were remarkable tonight." June turned to find him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with protection or duty. The space between them suddenly felt charged, intimate in a way that made her breath catch. "Your Grace—" "Cassian," he interrupted quietly. "When we are alone, you may call me Cassian." The intimacy of the request sent heat through June's veins. "Cassian," she repeated, testing the name. "Why did you really bring me tonight?" He was silent for a long moment. "I told myself it was strategic, a necessary social appearance." His jaw tightened. "But I find I wanted to see you shine, to watch you dismantle their prejudices with your intelligence, to prove to myself that my initial assessment was correct." "And was it?" "You exceeded it." His voice dropped lower. "Considerably." June couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her apartments watching dawn break over Greycourt's gardens, the night's triumph already curdling into doubt. In the cold light of early morning, the evening at Hartley House felt like a performance. Brilliant, perhaps, but fundamentally false. A servant girl playing Duchess, temporarily elevated by a duke's whim. How long before he tired of the novelty? How long before he realized the scandal of their association outweighed whatever intellectual curiosity she'd sparked? She was still standing there, wrapped in a dressing gown, when a knock came at the door. Annie entered with her usual cheerful efficiency, then stopped short. "Miss Willow, you haven't slept at all, have you?" June turned from the window, and whatever Annie saw in her face made the young maid's expression soften with concern. "I keep waiting," June said quietly, "for someone to wake me, to tell me this was all a dream, and I'm still in the scullery at Willow Manor." Annie crossed the room and took June's cold hands in her warm ones. "This is real, miss. You're here. You're safe." But safety, June was learning, was more terrifying than servitude. Servitude had clear rules, defined boundaries. This new life felt like walking on ice that might crack at any moment, plunging her back into the darkness. She made it through breakfast in her apartments, through the morning hours of correspondence and wardrobe consultations, holding herself together through sheer force of will. But when a footman delivered another letter from Lady Beatrice, more vitriol, more threats, more poison, something inside June finally fractured. She found herself at the Duke's study door without conscious decision, her hand raised to knock, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Enter," his voice carried through the heavy wood. Cassian sat behind his massive desk, surrounded by documents as always, but he looked up immediately when she entered. Whatever he saw in her expression made him rise to his feet. "June?" The sound of her given name in his voice nearly undid her completely. "I need to know the truth." Her voice shook despite her best efforts to control it. "I need to understand why you're doing this. All of this." I've explained. No. She cut him off, something desperate breaking free inside her. You've given me practical reasons, strategy and reputation and convenient arrangements, but I'm not a fool, Your Grace. Men like you don't marry servant girls to solve social problems. Men like you have dozens of options, hundreds of suitable women who could fill the role of Duchess without the scandal, without the complication. Cassian moved around the desk with predatory grace, his dark eyes never leaving her face. What are you asking me? I'm asking if I'm a project. The words tumbled out now, unstoppable. A beautiful reclamation, a wronged maiden you can rescue to prove something to yourself. I'm asking if you feel obligated because you witnessed my humiliation and your honor demanded intervention. I'm asking. Her voice broke. I'm asking if you'll discard me once the novelty fades and you realize what a liability I am. A liability. Cassian's voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. You saw how they looked at me last night. Even after I'd proven I could hold an intelligent conversation, you saw the whispers, the speculation. I will always be the maid who seduced a duke, the fallen woman elevated beyond her station. Your reputation. My reputation, Cassian interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade, is that of a ruthless bastard who destroys men for sport and feels nothing for anyone. Do you truly believe I would damage that carefully cultivated image to rescue someone I viewed as merely a project? June stared at him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Then why? Why me? Cassian closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his fearsome reputation. His touch was warm, solid, achingly real. Because when I saw you in that conservatory, enduring your stepmother's abuse with quiet dignity, I recognized something I thought had been beaten out of me years ago. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual control. Authenticity, real, unvarnished humanity. You stood there in a servant's gown with your arm bruised from her grip, and you didn't grovel. You didn't perform. You simply were, complete and unbroken despite everything they'd done to break you. I'm not unbroken, June whispered. I'm terrified. I don't know how to be what you need. You think I need a perfect duchess. A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh or a sob. I have attended 1,000 balls, endured 1,000 empty conversations with women who simper and perform and say exactly what they think I want to hear. Every word calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Do you understand how exhausting that becomes? How utterly hollow? His thumbs brushed away her tears with devastating tenderness. Then you stood before me, trembling and furious and real, and argued about Mill's conception of liberty, as though you'd forgotten you were supposed to be grateful and demure. You challenged me. You made me feel something beyond contempt and boredom for the first time in years. But I'm damaged, June said, the words barely audible. 7 years of servitude, of being told I was worthless, made you resilient, made you authentic, made you the only woman I've met who doesn't want something from me beyond basic human decency. Cassian's forehead dropped to rest against hers. I don't feel obligated, June. I feel desperate. Desperate to keep you here, to protect you, to watch your mind work and your spirit strengthen. Desperate for something real in a world built entirely on lies. June's hands came up to grip his wrists, anchoring herself to him. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brilliant and brave and kind despite every reason to be bitter. I know you tend orchids in the dark and read philosophy to remember who you are. I know you survived what would have destroyed most people. His voice dropped to a whisper. I know I look at you and feel something I thought I'd lost the capacity to feel. What? June asked, though her heart already knew the answer. Hope. The word hung between them, fragile and precious. Hope that perhaps I'm not as dead inside as I believed. That perhaps 2 broken people might create something whole. June pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, seeing them stripped of their usual armor. Raw, vulnerable, terrified in a way that mirrored her own terror. I'm afraid, she confessed. Afraid of failing you. Afraid of not being enough. And I'm afraid of losing you. Cassian's hands trembled against her face. Afraid that you'll realize you deserve better than a man with ice in his veins and a reputation for ruthlessness. But I'm asking you to stay anyway. Not as my project or my obligation, but as my partner, my equal, the only person I've ever wanted to be vulnerable with. June felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, the terrified, guarded thing she'd carried for 7 years, finally beginning to unfurl. "I'm staying," she whispered. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to be here, with you." Cassian's kiss was inevitable, necessary, a seal on promises neither of them fully understood yet. It was gentle despite his fearsome reputation, reverent despite his ruthless nature, and it tasted like hope and healing and home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Cassian pressed his forehead to hers once more. "We're going to destroy them," he said quietly. "Your stepmother, every person who tried to make you believe you were worthless. We're going to reclaim everything they stole and build something they can't touch." June smiled through her tears. Together? Always. The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied a dignified building on Lincoln's Inn Fields, all dark paneling and the musty scent of old documents. June sat beside Cassian in his carriage outside, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. "She requested this meeting," Cassian said quietly, his eyes on the building's entrance. "Which means she believes she has leverage. She doesn't know we've already dismantled her entire case." June turned to look at him, drawing strength from the cold certainty in his expression. In the week since their confession, something had shifted between them, a partnership forged not just from necessity, but from genuine understanding. He had shown her the evidence he'd compiled, piece by devastating piece. Now they would wield it together. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Mr. Whitmore's senior clerk led them to a conference room where Lady Beatrice already sat like a queen holding court, Eliza beside her in a gown of ostentatious pink that clashed violently with her complexion. Lady Beatrice's solicitor, a nervous-looking man named Mr. Pemberton, shuffled papers at the head of the table. Lady Beatrice's smile was pure venom. "Your Grace, how kind of you to attend, though I'm afraid this meeting concerns matters of property law that need not trouble a man of your standing." "On the contrary," Cassian said, his voice glacially polite as he held a chair for June. "As Miss Willow's betrothed, her property concerns are very much my affair." June settled into her seat, acutely aware of her stepmother's gaze raking over her sapphire walking dress and elegant coiffure. She met Lady Beatrice's eyes steadily, no longer the cowering servant girl who had scrubbed these women's floors. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Whitmore entered, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with shrewd eyes that assessed the room's dynamics in an instant. "Lady Beatrice, you requested this meeting to address certain claims regarding the Willow estate." "Indeed." Lady Beatrice's voice dripped with false regret. "It pains me greatly, but I cannot in good conscience allow this farce of a marriage to proceed without addressing certain legal realities. The girl you see before you, Miss June Willow, daughter of Jonathan Willow and Celeste Beaumont," Cassian interrupted smoothly. "Do be precise, Lady Beatrice." A flush crept up Lady Beatrice's neck. "This person has no legal claim to the Willow name or estate. My late husband's will was perfectly clear." "Which will would that be?" Cassian produced a document from his leather case with the casual precision of a duelist drawing a weapon. "The one filed with Mr. Whitmore's office in 1856, which names June Willow as sole inheritor, or the suspiciously amended version filed 3 months after Mr. Willow's death, which conveniently diverts the entire estate to you." The color drained from Lady Beatrice's face. "Your Grace, I don't know what you're implying," Mr. Pemberton began. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Cassian laid the document before Mr. Whitmore. "This is the original will, properly witnessed and sealed. You'll note the signatures match those in your firm's records from 1856. You'll also note that it bears no resemblance to the document Lady Beatrice presented for probate." Mr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, studying the papers with intense concentration. "This is most irregular." "What's irregular is forgery," Cassian continued. "I've also obtained testimony from Mr. Jonathan Willow's clerk, who witnessed the creation of the original will and can confirm that Mr. Willow never requested any amendments. Furthermore, he produced another sheaf of documents. I have statements from 3 former servants of Willow Manor detailing Lady Beatrice's systematic abuse of Miss Willow, including forced servitude, physical violence, and theft of personal property." "This is outrageous," Lady Beatrice's composure finally cracked. These are lies fabricated by a scheming girl who has clearly bewitched you. Mrs. Henderson, who served as housekeeper at Willow Manor for 15 years, describes in detail how you forced Miss Willow to sleep in the servants' quarters and perform scullery work. Cassian's voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made his words more devastating. Mr. Davies, the former groundskeeper, witnessed you strike Miss Willow across the face for the crime of reading her mother's books. And Miss Porter, who served as your own lady's maid until last year, has provided a particularly illuminating account of your instructions to break the girl's spirit through systematic humiliation. Eliza had gone white as parchment. Lady Beatrice's hands clutched the table edge so tightly her knuckles showed bone white. "You have no proof," she began. "I have sworn affidavits." Cassian laid them out one by one like cards in a winning hand. "I have the original will. I have bank records showing you systematically drained the estate's accounts for personal expenditures. I have correspondence between you and your solicitor discussing how to manage the girl's expectations regarding her inheritance." He paused. "Shall I continue?" June watched her stepmother's world crumble, feeling none of the satisfaction she'd imagined. Instead, she felt only a cold clarity, the recognition that Lady Beatrice was small, mean, and ultimately powerless against truth. "The purpose of this meeting," Lady Beatrice said, her voice shrill with desperation, "was to prevent an unsuitable marriage. This girl has no breeding, no moral character. This girl," June said quietly, speaking for the first time, "is the legitimate daughter of Jonathan Willow, educated by her mother in 3 languages, literature, and philosophy. She has survived 7 years of abuse without losing her integrity or intelligence, and she is engaged to marry a duke who considers her his intellectual equal." The silence that followed was profound. "Furthermore," Cassian continued, "any attempt to slander Miss Willow's character will be met with legal action for defamation. Any attempt to maintain your fraudulent claim to Willow Manor will result in criminal charges for forgery and theft. And any attempt to interfere with our marriage will be considered a personal offense against me." His eyes were obsidian, merciless. "I trust I'm being clear." Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Lady Beatrice, in light of this evidence, I must recommend you withdraw your claim to the Willow estate immediately. The original will is quite clear, and the amended version appears to be problematic." "Problematic?" Lady Beatrice's laugh bordered on hysteria. "You're going to take the word of a servant girl over mine." "I'm going to uphold the law," Mr. Whitmore said firmly, "and the law is unambiguous. Miss Willow is the rightful heir." Lady Beatrice stood so abruptly her chair toppled backward. "This isn't over. I'll appeal. You'll do nothing," Cassian said softly, "except sign the documents Mr. Whitmore prepares, transferring Willow Manor back to its rightful owner. Because if you don't, I will ensure that every detail of your fraud becomes public knowledge. Your daughter will never make a respectable match. You will be ruined, socially and financially, and you will very likely face criminal prosecution." He let that sink in before continuing. "Or you can sign the papers, accept a modest pension sufficient to maintain a quiet life in the country, and disappear from London society. The choice is yours." June watched her stepmother's face cycle through rage, fear, and finally defeated calculation. Lady Beatrice had built her life on manipulation and social maneuvering. She knew when she'd been outplayed. "I'll sign," she whispered. An hour later, June stood outside the solicitor's office, the legal documents securing her inheritance tucked safely in Cassian's case. The November air was cold against her face, but she felt warm, light, as though an enormous weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. "It's done," she said wonderingly. "It's really done." Cassian's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. "You're free, June. Truly free." She turned to face him, this complicated man who had saved her not out of obligation, but out of recognition, of seeing her soul and claiming it as worthy of protection. "No," she said softly. "We're free, both of us." His smile was rare and genuine and entirely hers. "Yes, we are." The chapel at Greycourt was small, built by Cassian's great-grandfather for private family worship. Morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting patterns of sapphire and ruby across the stone floor, where June stood in a gown of ivory silk, so fine it seemed woven from moonlight. She had no family to give her away, no bridesmaids in pastel gowns, no crowds of well-wishers. Just Cassian waiting at the altar in formal black, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and Lord Hartley standing as witness with Mrs. Davison beside him, both wearing expressions of quiet approval. The vicar's words washed over June like a benediction, ancient promises made new by the certainty in Cassian's voice as he repeated his vows. When it came her turn, she spoke clearly, no longer the trembling girl who had fled the ballroom mere weeks ago. I, June Willow, take you, Cassian Thorne, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. The words felt like transformation, like the final shedding of a chrysalis she'd been trapped in for 7 years. When Cassian slipped the ring onto her finger, a band of platinum set with sapphires, the exact shade of her gown, his hands trembled slightly. This man who faced down lords and destroyed reputations without a flicker of emotion was shaking as he made her his wife. "You may kiss your bride," the vicar said, smiling. Cassian's kiss was gentle, reverent, and utterly certain. June felt it in her bones, the promise of safety, partnership, and something deeper than mere protection. When they drew apart, she saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "Duchess," he murmured, testing the word. "Duke," she replied, and watched his rare smile transform his severe features into something approaching joy. The societal reception that evening was a different matter entirely, a calculated display of power held in Greycourt's massive ballroom. Every influential family in London had received an invitation, and none had dared refuse. June stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep crimson silk, Cassian's hand warm at the small of her back, and looked down at the sea of faces that had once seemed so intimidating. "Ready?" Cassian asked quietly. June thought of the girl who had scrubbed these very floors in other grand houses, who had hidden behind curtains and made herself invisible. That girl was gone, transmuted into someone who could stand beside a duke and claim her place without apology. "Ready," she confirmed. The major domo's voice rang out. His Grace, the Duke of Greycourt, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Greycourt. They descended together, and June felt the weight of every gaze, every whispered speculation. But she also felt Cassian's unwavering presence beside her, and the knowledge that she had earned this place not through seduction or manipulation, but through surviving what should have broken her. Lord Hartley approached first, bowing over her hand with theatrical gallantry. "Your Grace, you are radiant. Greycourt is a fortunate man." "I am the fortunate one, my lord," June replied, and meant it. The evening passed in a whirl of introductions and careful conversations, each interaction a small victory. Lady Pemberton, who had cut her dead at a musicale years ago, now fawned over her gown. The Countess of Essex requested her opinion on educational reform. Young debutantes studied her with a mixture of envy and fascination. And through it all, Cassian remained at her side, not hovering protectively, but standing as her equal, his pride in her evident in every glance. It was near midnight when June finally found a moment alone in the conservatory, seeking refuge among the ferns and orchids that reminded her of her mother's garden. She was standing before a rare midnight orchid when Cassian's reflection appeared in the glass behind her. "Escaping your own reception?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. Catching my breath, June turned to face him. "I've been thinking about Willow Manor, about what to do with it now that it's mine again. And I don't want to live there. Too many ghosts, too many years of pain." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "But I don't want it to stand empty either. I thought perhaps," she paused, gathering courage, "I thought perhaps it could become a refuge for women who have nowhere else to go, women escaping abuse, or widows without resources, or girls who've been cast out by their families." Cassian's expression shifted, something profound moving behind his eyes. "A foundation. The Celeste Willow Foundation for Women's Independence," June said, the idea taking fuller shape as she spoke. "We could provide shelter, education, job training, help them become self-sufficient rather than dependent on charity or marriage. Transform your prison into someone else's liberation." Cassian's voice was rough with emotion. "June, it's what I needed when I had nothing," she finished. a place that saw my worth beyond my circumstances, support without condescension, freedom with dignity. Cassian pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce tenderness that still surprised her. "You are extraordinary. You know that?" June laughed against his chest. "I'm practical. There's a difference." "No." He pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes blazing with certainty. "You survived abuse that would have destroyed most people. You emerged with your integrity and intelligence intact. You married me not for my title or wealth, but because you saw past my reputation to the broken man beneath. And now you want to use your reclaimed fortune not for revenge or luxury, but to help others." His hands framed her face. "You are extraordinary, June, and I am in awe of you." Tears pricked June's eyes. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You would have found a way. You're too strong not to." Cassian's thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. "But I'm grateful I could be part of your story. That you let me in despite every reason to keep yourself guarded. You saw me," June said simply. "When I was invisible to everyone else, you saw me." "I saw you," he agreed, "and I've been falling more in love with you every day since." The words hung between them, precious and profound. They had married for protection, for practical reasons, for mutual benefit. But somewhere in the weeks of partnership and vulnerability, something far deeper had taken root. "I love you too," June whispered. "So much, it terrifies me sometimes." "Good." Cassian's smile was wicked and warm. "We can be terrified together." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and June felt the last vestiges of her old fears dissolve. She was no longer the maid forced to serve in her own home, no longer the invisible girl making herself small to survive. She was the Duchess of Greycourt, partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, free to pursue her own purpose, secure in a love she'd never dared to imagine. When they finally returned to the reception, walking hand in hand through the glittering ballroom, June caught sight of their reflection in one of the massive gilt mirrors. The severe Duke and his radiant Duchess, transformed by the alchemy of recognition and respect into something neither had thought possible. A partnership, a love, a home. Behind them, through the ballroom windows, Greycourt's gardens stretched into darkness. But inside, surrounded by light and music, and the man who had claimed her not as property but as equal, June finally understood what freedom felt like. It felt like coming home to herself. It felt like being seen. It felt like love. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with your loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep telling more stories full of love, redemption, and emotional twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.